From the moment I walked through those glass doors at Henderson and Associates, something inside me just clicked into place. It wasn't about making a name for myself or climbing some corporate ladder that stretched endlessly into fluorescent-lit mediocrity. No, it was simpler than that. And maybe that's where I went wrong from the start. I just wanted things to work. I wanted our team to be the one that other departments looked at with respect, maybe even a little envy. I wanted us to deliver work so clean, so thorough, that the executives would stop thinking of us as just another cost center and start seeing us as the backbone that kept everything running smoothly. Maybe it sounds naive now, looking back through the bitter lens of experience, but I genuinely believe that good work spoke for itself. I was the one who stayed until the parking lot emptied and the cleaning crew started their rounds, hunched over my desk with a lukewarm cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. When systems crashed, when deadlines moved up without warning, when someone else's mistake threatened to derail an entire project, I was there. I'd roll up my sleeves, take a deep breath, and dive in headfirst. Sometimes I'd catch myself holding back tears of frustration when I had to redo entire presentations because someone hadn't bothered to check their facts. But I'd swallow that emotion down and keep going. The team came first, always. Trust, I learned, is a dangerous thing when you give it too freely. But back then, in those early months when everything still felt possible, trust felt like the foundation of something beautiful we were building together. I trusted that hard work would be recognized, that loyalty would be returned, that the long nights and weekend calls would eventually pay off not just in numbers on a spreadsheet, but in the kind of professional respect that makes you walk a little taller. I trusted that when you help someone grow, when you share your knowledge and your networks and your hard-earned expertise, they remember where it came from. But trust, as I would soon discover, can be as fragile as it is precious, and some people see it not as a bond, but as an opportunity. Rebecca came into our department on a Tuesday morning in March, clutching a leather portfolio like it was a life preserver, and wearing the kind of nervous smile that immediately made you want to help her succeed. She was fresh out of graduate school, all sharp blazers and carefully rehearsed answers, but underneath that polished exterior, I could see the uncertainty flickering in her eyes. During her first team meeting, when our supervisor asked her to introduce herself, her voice caught slightly when she mentioned her previous internship experience. It was endearing, honestly. It reminded me of my own first days, when every task felt like a test I might fail, and every conversation with senior staff left me second-guessing every word I'd said. I made it my mission to be the colleague I'd wished for during those early, terrifying weeks of my career. I invited Rebecca to grab coffee after her second day, and we sat in the break room while I walked her through the unwritten rules that no training manual ever covers. Where to find the good printer that doesn't jam every third page, which vendors actually deliver on time, and which ones require daily follow-up calls. How to read the subtle signs that meant a project was about to explode into chaos, and you needed to start preparing damage control immediately. She listened with the kind of intense focus that made me feel useful, important even. She took notes in a neat, precise handwriting and asked thoughtful questions that showed she was really absorbing what I was telling her. Within her first month, Rebecca started calling me her work lifeline, and I have to admit, it felt good. There's something deeply satisfying about being needed, about being the person someone turns to when they're in over their head and need a steady hand to guide them through. She'd appear at my cubicle with that slightly panicked expression I'd come to recognize, holding a project brief or a client email, and I'd drop whatever I was doing to help her pass through the requirements and figure out the best approach. I shared my contact lists, my project templates, even my personal system for organizing complex research tasks. I showed her how to anticipate what the executives would ask for before they asked for it, how to build presentations that told a story, instead of just dumping data onto slides. Looking back now, I can see the pattern that was already forming, but at the time it just felt like good teamwork. We were building something together, or at least that's what I thought. Rebecca would come to me with rough drafts and half-formed ideas, and I'd help her shape them into something polished and professional. She'd handle the initial client calls and stakeholder meetings, gathering requirements and taking notes, while I'd do the heavy lifting of analysis and strategic thinking. It seemed like a natural division of labor, playing to our respective strengths. She was great with people, charming and personable in a way that put clients at ease, while I excelled at the behind-the-scenes work that turned good intentions into concrete results. But even then, in those early days of our partnership, there were small signs I should have noticed, tiny cracks in the foundation of what I thought was mutual respect and collaboration. The morning it all came crashing down started like any other Tuesday. I'd grabbed my usual vanilla latte from the coffee cart downstairs and settled into my desk, ready to tackle the quarterly client presentation that had consumed my thoughts for the better part of 2 weeks. This wasn't just any presentation. It was the kind of high-stakes project that could reshape our department's reputation within the company. The client was Henderson and Associates' biggest account, a manufacturing giant that had been hemorrhaging money due to supply chain inefficiencies, and they'd come to us desperate for solutions. The pressure was immense, but I thrived under that kind of challenge. I'd spent countless hours poring over their financial reports, conducting market research, and developing a comprehensive strategy that could save them millions. What made this particular betrayal so devastating wasn't just the theft of my work, it was the calculated precision with which it was executed. 2 nights before the big presentation, Rebecca had sent me a panicked message around 9 in the evening. The draft we'd been working on was falling apart, she said, and she was worried we'd embarrass ourselves in front of the executives. Could I take a look and maybe help her tighten things up? Of course I said yes. I always said yes. I spent the entire night at my kitchen table, laptop glowing in the darkness, while my roommate slept soundly in the next room, completely restructuring the presentation from the ground up. I rewrote every slide, restructured the entire argument, and added supporting data that transformed a mediocre proposal into something truly compelling. By 3 in the morning, I'd created what I knew was exceptional work. The presentation now told a clear, persuasive story about how strategic partnerships and technological upgrades could revolutionize the client's operations. I'd included detailed financial projections, risk assessments, and implementation timelines that demonstrated not just what needed to be done, but exactly how to do it. Every chart was perfectly formatted. Every transition was smooth and logical. Every recommendation was backed by solid research. I was exhausted but proud as I hit send, attaching the final version with a note telling Rebecca she should review it once more before the meeting, just to make sure everything flowed the way she wanted it to. The morning of the presentation, I arrived at the office expecting the usual pre-meeting jitters and last-minute preparations. Instead, I found Rebecca in the conference room, calmly printing out materials with my presentation displayed on her laptop screen. But something was wrong. The title slide, which had originally read Supply Chain Optimization Strategy, prepared by Rebecca Chen and Sarah Martinez, now showed only her name. My name had been erased as if I'd never existed, as if the countless hours I'd spent crafting every word and analyzing every data point had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination. When I asked her about it, she barely looked up from the printer. "Oh, I made some last-minute changes," she said with the kind of casual dismissiveness that made my stomach drop. "I thought it would be cleaner to have just one presenter listed, you know? Less confusing for the client." The way she said it, so matter-of-factly, as if she was doing me some kind of favor by erasing my contribution, was like a slap across the face. I stood there in that sterile conference room, listening to the hum of the printer churning out my stolen work, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't an oversight or a miscommunication. This was deliberate. This was calculated. This was the moment I realized that everything I'd believed about our partnership had been built on quicksand. The actual presentation was a masterclass in professional theft. Rebecca stood at the front of the room, confident and composed, delivering my words as if they'd sprung fully formed from her own mind. She used phrases I'd crafted, cited research I'd conducted, and presented solutions I'd developed through weeks of painstaking analysis. The executives were clearly impressed. I watched from my seat at the side of the table as they nodded approvingly, jotted down notes, and asked follow-up questions that demonstrated they were genuinely engaged with the material. Our department head, Michael, kept glancing at Rebecca with the kind of pride typically reserved for a star athlete who'd just scored the winning goal. What hurt most wasn't just the theft itself, but the way Rebecca had transformed my analytical approach into her own narrative style. She'd kept the substance of my work, but wrapped it in her characteristic charm and confidence, making it seem like the strategic insights had emerged from her natural business acumen rather than from the methodical research process I'd developed over years of experience. When the client's CFO asked about the methodology behind our financial projections, Rebecca answered smoothly, explaining concepts I'd taught her just weeks earlier as if she'd been using them for years. She even threw in a casual anecdote about staying up all night running numbers. That made it sound like she'd been the one burning the midnight oil while I'd been sleeping peacefully at home. The days following that presentation felt like living in an alternate reality, where everyone had collectively agreed to pretend I didn't exist. It wasn't just Rebecca who had betrayed me, though her theft of my work was the most visible and painful part of the whole ordeal. What cut deeper, what kept me awake at night staring at the ceiling, while my mind raced through endless loops of confusion and hurt, was the systematic way that everyone else in the office had chosen to look the other way. The silence was deafening. My colleagues, people I'd worked alongside for 3 years, people I'd helped with their own projects and covered for during their sick days, and celebrated with during company happy hours, had witnessed my professional assassination, and decided it wasn't worth commenting on. Michael, our department head, was perhaps the most disappointing of all. He'd been copying me on emails about the project for weeks, watching me stay late to work on research, even stopping by my desk occasionally to check on my progress and offer encouragement. The night before the presentation, I'd sent him a quick update letting him know I'd be working late to finalize everything, and that it was looking really strong. He'd responded with a thumbs up emoji and a thanks for all your hard work on this one, Sarah. But when Rebecca stood up in that conference room and took credit for every insight, every analysis, every carefully crafted recommendation, Michael just sat there nodding along, as if he'd never seen me labor over spreadsheets or heard me talking through strategic approaches with obvious passion and expertise. After the meeting, when the executives were filing out and congratulating Rebecca on her exceptional work, I tried to catch Michael's eye, hoping for some acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Instead, he was busy shaking hands with the client's CEO, beaming with pride as if he'd personally mentored Rebecca to this moment of triumph. When I finally managed to corner him later that afternoon, he brushed off my concerns with the kind of casual dismissiveness that made me question whether I'd imagined the entire betrayal. "These big presentations are always collaborative efforts," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "What matters is that we delivered great work as a team." The word team felt like acid in my mouth. There had been no team in that conference room, just a thief and her unwitting accomplices. The other colleagues weren't much better. Jenny from accounting, who'd borrowed my research templates countless times and always made a point of thanking me for being so generous with my knowledge, suddenly seemed to develop selective amnesia about my involvement in the project. When I mentioned to her over lunch that I'd been surprised by how the presentation had been handled, she gave me a vague smile and changed the subject to weekend plans. David from marketing, who'd specifically asked me to keep him updated on our progress because his team would be implementing some of our recommendations, acted as if Rebecca had been the sole point of contact all along. Even Lisa, my closest friend in the office, and someone I'd confided in about the long hours I'd been putting in, seemed reluctant to engage when I tried to process what had happened. The worst part was how quickly the new narrative took hold. Within a week of the presentation, Rebecca was being invited to meetings I'd previously attended. She was suddenly copied on email chains where strategic decisions were being made. People started referring to her as the supply chain expert and asking for her input on projects that had nothing to do with her actual area of expertise. It was as if my years of building relationships and establishing credibility had been transferred to her overnight, like some kind of professional identity theft that everyone had tacitly agreed to enable. I found myself excluded from conversations about follow-up work with the client, despite having developed the foundational analysis that made the whole engagement possible. What made it even more surreal was how Rebecca began to embody the role she'd stolen from me. She started speaking with newfound authority about strategic planning concepts, using terminology and frameworks I'd taught her as if she'd always been fluent in this language. She'd reference case studies and industry trends that came directly from research I'd shared with her, weaving them into conversations with the confidence of someone who'd discovered these insights through her own intellectual curiosity. Watching her transform my expertise into her personal brand felt like witnessing an elaborate magic trick where the magician makes someone disappear and then convinces the audience that person never existed in the first place. The isolation was crushing. I'd go to team meetings and find myself relegated to the role of silent observer, while Rebecca fielded questions about strategic direction and implementation details. When I tried to contribute to discussions, offering insights based on my deep understanding of the subject matter, my comments were met with polite nods that somehow managed to be more dismissive than outright disagreement. It was as if everyone had collectively decided that Rebecca was now the authority on everything I'd spent months becoming an expert in, and my voice was no longer relevant to conversations I'd essentially created. The frustration and confusion left me feeling like I was slowly disappearing, becoming invisible even to myself. The transition from valued team member to expendable background figure happened so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first. It started with small things, subtle shifts in how projects were assigned and how meetings were structured. Rebecca, riding high on the success of what everyone now considered her presentation, was suddenly being positioned as the department's rising star. 3 weeks after the client meeting, Michael called her into his office for what he described as a strategic planning session about upcoming projects. I only found out about it when I overheard Rebecca mentioning it to Jenny by the coffee machine, laughing about how she'd never expected to be involved in high-level planning so early in her career. The official announcement came during our monthly team meeting in early April. Michael stood at the front of the conference room with his usual stack of papers, and that slightly artificial smile he wore when delivering news he thought would be received as exciting. "I'm pleased to announce that Rebecca will be taking on expanded responsibilities as our new strategic projects coordinator," he said, the title rolling off his tongue as if it had existed for years, rather than being invented specifically for her. Her outstanding work on the Henderson account has shown us that she has the vision and analytical skills to lead some of our most important initiatives. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it, but I sat there maintaining the same professional composure I'd cultivated over years of corporate life. What followed was a systematic dismantling of my professional relevance. Projects I'd been working on were quietly reassigned to Rebecca's oversight, with me relegated to providing support and research assistance as needed. The quarterly budget analysis I'd been preparing for months was suddenly handed over to her, with Michael explaining that it would be good for her to get exposure to financial planning. When I pointed out that I was already 3/4 of the way through the complex data analysis required for that report, he waved off my concerns with a dismissive gesture. "I'm sure Rebecca will benefit from your insights as she takes the lead on this," he said, somehow managing to make my expertise sound like a minor convenience rather than the foundation the entire project was built on. The most humiliating moment came when Rebecca was assigned to coordinate the follow-up work with our big client, the same manufacturing company whose problems I'd spent weeks analyzing and whose solutions I'd crafted in those long, exhausting nights. She was scheduled to have weekly check-ins with their executive team, monitoring the implementation of recommendations that had emerged directly from my research and strategic thinking. When I asked Michael if I should continue my involvement given my familiarity with the technical details, he looked genuinely confused by the question. "Rebecca's got it handled," he said, as if my months of deep diving into their operational challenges had been nothing more. then preliminary work that was no longer needed now that the real professional had taken over. I became a ghost in my own workplace, present but not really seen, contributing but never acknowledged. Rebecca would stop by my desk with requests that felt more like orders, asking me to pull data or verify facts for presentations she was giving to executives I'd never even met. "Could you double-check the numbers on slide 12? She'd ask, holding out a printed version of what had clearly started as my analysis, but had been reformatted and rebranded with her signature style. I found myself in the bizarre position of fact-checking my own work, like an editor reviewing an article where someone else had been credited as the author. The requests were always framed as favors, little tasks that would help the team succeed, but the power dynamic was unmistakable. The final insult came when Rebecca was invited to present at the company's annual strategy summit, a prestigious event where only the most promising employees were asked to share their insights with senior leadership from across all divisions. She was scheduled to speak about innovative approaches to client problem-solving, using case studies and methodologies that I had developed and refined over the course of several years. When I saw the announcement in the company newsletter, complete with a professional headshot of Rebecca and a bio that described her as a strategic thinking expert, I felt something inside me break in a way that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. The morning of her presentation, Rebecca stopped by my desk one last time. She was wearing a navy blazer I'd never seen before, and carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive and new. "I just wanted to thank you for all your support on this," she said, her voice carrying the kind of saccharine gratitude that somehow managed to be more insulting than outright hostility. "I know I couldn't have gotten here without the foundation you helped me build." The word foundation felt particularly cruel, as if my expertise and hard work were nothing more than concrete poured to support someone else's architectural vision. I managed to smile and wish her luck, but inside I was screaming at the injustice of it all, at how completely she'd managed to erase me from my own professional story. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late September, just as I was finishing up a data analysis that no one had asked for, but that I'd been working on anyway, desperately trying to prove my continued value to an organization that had already written me off. "Sarah, could you come to HR when you have a moment?" The voice belonged to Patricia from Human Resources, and there was something in her tone, a carefully practiced neutrality that immediately set off alarm bells in my head. I'd heard that voice before, directed to other employees who'd been called into similar meetings and emerged 20 minutes later, carrying cardboard boxes and wearing expressions of shell-shocked disbelief. The walk to the HR office felt endless, even though it was just down one hallway and around a corner. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to convince myself that maybe this was about updating my emergency contacts or discussing my performance review schedule. But deep down, I knew. The signs had been accumulating for weeks like storm clouds gathering on a horizon I'd been trying not to look at. The gradual exclusion from important meetings, the reassignment of my projects, the way conversations would pause when I entered a room and resume with forced enthusiasm after I'd passed by. I'd been in professional limbo for months, and limbo, I was about to learn, is not a sustainable state of existence in the corporate world. Patricia was waiting for me with a manila folder and the kind of sympathetic expression that probably took years of HR training to perfect. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, the same chair where I'd sat 3 years earlier as an excited new hire, eager to prove myself and convinced that hard work and dedication would be rewarded with recognition and advancement. The symmetry was almost poetic, if poetry could be written in the language of bureaucratic disappointment and institutional betrayal. She opened the folder and began reading from what was clearly a scripted explanation of why my position was being eliminated due to restructuring and evolving departmental needs. The words washed over me like background noise, while I tried to process the surreal reality of what was happening. According to Patricia's carefully prepared statement, the company was streamlining operations and focusing resources on their most strategic initiatives. My role, which had apparently become redundant, was being eliminated as part of a broader effort to create a more efficient organizational structure. She used phrases like right-sizing and optimizing human capital allocation, as if corporate jargon could somehow soften the brutal reality that I was being discarded like outdated equipment. The most insulting part was how she kept emphasizing that this was in no way a reflection of my performance or value as an employee, just an unfortunate consequence of business evolution. What made the termination particularly cruel was the timing and the context. Just 2 weeks earlier, Rebecca had been promoted to Senior Strategic Analyst, a position that came with a significant salary increase and expanded authority over the very projects I'd originated and developed. The company newsletter had featured a glowing profile of her rapid rise, complete with quotes from Michael about her exceptional strategic thinking and natural leadership abilities. Meanwhile, I was being told that my position was no longer necessary, that the work I'd been doing could be absorbed by other team members as part of their regular responsibilities. The disconnect was so obvious, so deliberately obtuse, that I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. The severance package was standard, 2 weeks' pay plus accumulated vacation time, presented as if it was some kind of generous gesture, rather than the legal minimum required to avoid potential lawsuits. Patricia walked me through the paperwork with the same methodical precision she probably used for every termination, explaining my options for continuing health insurance and the process for collecting my final paycheck. She handed me a business card for a career counseling service, as if the problem was my inability to market myself effectively rather than the systematic theft of my professional identity by someone who'd learned everything she knew from sitting in the chair next to mine. The most surreal part of the entire experience was how normal everything felt afterward. I cleaned out my desk while my former colleagues continued their usual work routines, occasionally glancing over with expressions of mild sympathy, but never actually approaching to ask what had happened or offer any words of support. Rebecca was nowhere to be seen, conveniently scheduled for an all-day client meeting that kept her out of the office during my final hours. It was probably for the best, honestly, because I'm not sure I could have maintained my composure if I'd had to face her artificial concern and hollow promises to stay in touch. By 5 o'clock, I was walking out of Henderson & Associates for the last time, carrying 3 years of my professional life in a cardboard box that felt surprisingly light. The strangest part was the sense of relief that washed over me as the elevator doors closed and I descended toward the lobby. For months, I'd been fighting to maintain my relevance in an environment that had already decided I was expendable. I'd been struggling to prove my worth to people who'd systematically devalued my contributions and erased my accomplishments. The termination, as devastating as it was to my financial security and professional confidence, also felt like the end of a prolonged torture session. I no longer had to pretend that everything was normal, no longer had to smile and nod while watching someone else receive credit for my ideas and insights. The betrayal was complete, but at least it was finally honest. The first few weeks after leaving Henderson & Associates were like living in a strange, muffled version of reality where time moved differently and nothing felt quite real. I'd wake up at my usual 6:30 alarm, my body still programmed for a routine that no longer existed, and lie in bed staring at the ceiling while the weight of my new reality settled over me like a heavy blanket. The silence was overwhelming. No urgent emails demanding immediate attention, no meetings to prepare for, no colleagues stopping by my desk with questions only I could answer. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't buzzing with work-related notifications, and the absence of that constant digital chatter felt more disorienting than peaceful. My apartment, which had always been a refuge from the demands of corporate life, suddenly felt like a prison. Every corner reminded me of late nights spent working on projects that no longer belonged to me, of weekend calls I'd taken while pacing around my living room, trying to solve problems that someone else would ultimately take credit for fixing. The dining table where I'd spread out reports and charts, transforming my home into an extension of my office, now seemed too big and too empty. I'd find myself sitting there for hours, scrolling through job postings on my laptop without really reading them, paralyzed by the strange, combination of desperate urgency and complete emotional exhaustion that seemed to define my new existence. The hardest part wasn't the financial stress, though that was certainly real and pressing. It was the way the termination had shattered my fundamental understanding of how the professional world was supposed to work. I'd been raised to believe that competence and dedication would be rewarded, that good people who did good work would be recognized and valued by their organizations. The systematic theft of my contributions and the casual disposal of my expertise had revealed that belief to be not just naive, but dangerously misguided. I felt like someone who discovered that a fundamental law of physics didn't actually apply, leaving me uncertain about which other assumptions about reality might also be illusions. Sleep became elusive, replaced by long nights of replaying conversations and analyzing interactions for signs I should have noticed earlier. I'd lie awake reconstructing meetings where Rebecca had positioned herself as the originator of ideas that had actually emerged from our collaborative discussions, wondering how I'd missed the subtle ways she'd been rewriting our shared history. The betrayal felt personal in a way that surprised me with its intensity. It wasn't just about losing a job or being treated unfairly by management. It was about discovering that someone I'd trusted and helped had been systematically undermining me while accepting my guidance and support with apparent gratitude. What made the isolation even more painful was how completely I'd been erased from the narrative of my own professional accomplishments. When I checked LinkedIn and saw updates from my former colleagues, including posts celebrating Rebecca's continued success on projects I'd initiated, it felt like watching my own funeral while still being alive. The work I'd poured my expertise and creativity into was flourishing under someone else's name, being praised and built upon as if I'd never existed. Former clients who'd specifically requested my input on strategic decisions were now working exclusively with Rebecca, apparently unaware that she'd inherited, rather than developed, the insights they valued so highly. The social aspects of unemployment proved just as challenging as the practical ones. Friends would ask about work with the casual interest of people who assumed everything was fine, and I'd find myself crafting vague explanations about exploring new opportunities, rather than admitting I'd been fired after being professionally eviscerated by someone I'd mentored. The shame was irrational but overwhelming, as if being betrayed and discarded somehow reflected a personal failing, rather than a systemic problem with workplace dynamics and ethical behavior. I started declining social invitations, partly to save money but mostly to avoid the awkward conversations about my career status that seemed to dominate every interaction. Perhaps the most devastating realization was how few people from my former workplace reached out after my departure. I'd worked closely with dozens of colleagues over 3 years, building what I'd thought were genuine professional relationships based on mutual respect and shared experiences. But once I was no longer useful to their daily operations, I essentially ceased to exist in their professional universe. No one called to check on how I was doing. No one sent casual messages asking about my job search. No one seemed curious about my perspective on the circumstances surrounding my termination. The silence was a harsh reminder that workplace relationships, no matter how warm and collaborative they might seem, are often more transactional than truly personal. The lessons that emerged from the wreckage of my professional life at Henderson and Associates weren't the kind you learn from motivational books or leadership seminars. They were hard-earned insights carved out of betrayal and disappointment, the kind of wisdom that comes only from having your fundamental assumptions about fairness and reciprocity systematically dismantled by people you trusted. Today, when I see someone in my current workplace exhibiting the same generous, trusting behavior I once displayed, I feel a powerful urge to pull them aside and share what I've learned about the dangers of professional naivety. But I've come to understand that these lessons can't be taught, only experienced, and that warning someone about betrayal often sounds like cynicism until they've lived through it themselves. The most fundamental shift in my professional approach has been learning to protect my intellectual property with the same vigilance that companies use to guard their trade secrets. I no longer share detailed research methodologies or analytical frameworks without clear attribution and documentation. Every email containing substantive insights gets copied to multiple stakeholders, creating an electronic paper trail that makes it difficult for others to claim credit for my work. I've developed a systematic approach to documenting my contributions to collaborative projects, maintaining detailed records of meetings, decisions, and creative breakthroughs that can serve as evidence if anyone attempts to rewrite history. It sounds paranoid, and maybe it is, but paranoia born from experience is just another word for wisdom. Trust, I've learned, is not a binary concept, but rather a spectrum that requires constant calibration based on observed behavior rather than stated intentions. I still believe in collaboration and teamwork, but I now approach professional relationships with the kind of careful assessment that I once reserved for major financial investments. I watch how potential collaborators treat other colleagues, how they handle credit and recognition, how they respond when their own contributions are questioned or overlooked. People reveal their character not through grand gestures but through small, everyday choices about honesty and integrity, and I've become expert at reading those subtle signals that once escaped my notice entirely. The most liberating aspect of this hard-won wisdom has been learning to advocate for myself with the same passion I once reserved for advocating for my team. I no longer assume that good work will speak for itself, or that dedication will automatically be recognized and rewarded. Instead, I've developed skills in self-promotion and credit claiming that felt foreign and uncomfortable at first, but have proven essential for professional survival. I speak up in meetings when my ideas are being discussed. I send follow-up emails summarizing my contributions to important projects, and I never hesitate to correct misconceptions about who originated particular strategies or solutions. It's not about being aggressive or territorial. It's about ensuring that my professional narrative remains accurate and complete. Perhaps the most painful but necessary lesson has been accepting that loyalty is often a one-way street in corporate environments, and that treating it as a mutual obligation can lead to devastating personal and professional consequences. I still value loyalty as a personal virtue, but I no longer offer it unconditionally or expect it to be reciprocated simply because I've extended it to others. Professional relationships, I've learned, are fundamentally transactional, and while they can certainly involve genuine warmth and mutual respect, they should never be confused with the kind of unconditional support that defines true friendship. Understanding this distinction has protected me from repeating the mistakes that made me vulnerable to Rebecca's calculated exploitation of my generosity. The hardest part of integrating these lessons into my daily professional life has been finding the balance between protecting myself and remaining open to genuine collaboration and mentorship opportunities. I don't want to become so guarded that I miss chances to build meaningful professional relationships or contribute to projects that could benefit from my expertise. But I also can't afford to return to the naive generosity that left me exposed to systematic exploitation. The solution has been developing what I think of as strategic vulnerability, being selective about when and with whom I share my knowledge and insights, and always ensuring that my contributions are properly documented and attributed before they become part of larger, collaborative efforts. If this story resonated with you, if you learned something about protecting yourself in the workplace, or recognizing the warning signs of professional betrayal, then subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. I'll continue sharing insights about workplace dynamics, professional survival, and the hard-earned lessons that most career advice never covers. Because the truth about corporate life isn't pretty, but it's necessary knowledge if you want to protect yourself and build a career that truly belongs to you.